Some promises are worth more than $1 billion. Nobody in the restaurant understood why the man in the tailored charcoal suit couldn't take his eyes off the simple silver necklace hanging around the young waitress's neck. It wasn't covered in diamonds. It wasn't made of gold. It looked old, slightly worn, almost forgotten by time. Yet Daniel Harrington, founder of one of the largest investment companies in America and a billionaire whose signature could move markets before lunch, stared at it as though the entire world had suddenly gone silent. Around him, conversations continued beneath sparkling chandeliers. Crystal glasses clinked softly. Waiters carried sizzling steaks past tables filled with executives discussing mergers and stock prices. Outside, the streets of Manhattan shimmered beneath the warm glow of an autumn evening. Inside, Claire Bennett moved gracefully from one table to another with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years serving strangers without ever expecting to be noticed. At 26, Claire had learned that people usually remembered the meal, never the waitress. She preferred it that way. Her blonde hair was tied neatly behind her head. Her white shirt was perfectly pressed despite the long shift. The only thing she never changed was the silver necklace resting gently above her heart. Some customers assumed it was cheap. Others guessed it was sentimental. No one had ever asked twice after she smiled politely and changed the subject. Until tonight. Claire approached Daniel's table carrying a fresh cup of black coffee. "Your refill, sir." Her voice was calm, warm, almost effortless. Daniel barely heard her. His eyes remained fixed on the necklace. Every detail felt painfully familiar. The small oval pendant, the delicate engraving around its edge, even the tiny scratch near the clasp. His heartbeat slowed before suddenly racing faster than it had in years. Claire noticed his expression and offered a courteous smile. "Is everything all right?" Daniel looked up, blinking as though returning from another lifetime. "That necklace," he said quietly. "Would you consider selling it?" Claire glanced down instinctively, her fingertips brushing the pendant with unconscious affection. She smiled politely. "I'm sorry, sir. It's not for sale." Daniel reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed a business card on the table beside a checkbook. "I'll give you $10,000. Claire thought she had misheard him. $10,000 could pay nearly every bill waiting on the small kitchen table inside her modest apartment. It could replace her aging car. It could finally allow her to stop working double shifts every weekend. Yet she shook her head almost immediately. "Thank you, but I can't." Daniel leaned back slowly, studying her face instead of the necklace for the first time. There was no excitement in her eyes. No calculation. No hesitation born from negotiation. Only quiet certainty. That answer surprised him far more than the refusal itself. Most people bargained. Most people asked for more. Claire simply held the coffee pot against her apron and waited patiently for his response. Around them, a nearby businessman laughed loudly after closing a deal. A birthday celebration erupted near the windows as candles flickered across a chocolate cake. Life continued exactly as it had only moments before. Yet at table 12, something invisible had already begun to change. Daniel looked once more at the necklace. 15 years of unanswered questions pressed heavily against his chest. 15 years of newspaper headlines, search teams, private investigators, sleepless nights, and memories he had never learned to silence. He had convinced himself that some doors were never meant to reopen. Until now. Claire offered a gentle nod. "Enjoy your evening, sir." She turned and walked away toward another table without realizing that every step carried the weight of a story she had never been told. Daniel watched her disappear into the busy dining room, unable to look anywhere else. Then, almost under his breath, he whispered words no one around him could hear. "It can't be. Unless..." Claire Bennett finished her shift nearly an hour later than usual. The last guest drifted out into the cool Manhattan night while the restaurant slowly returned to silence. Chairs were straightened. Candles were extinguished one by one. The scent of fresh coffee gave way to the familiar smell of polished wood and lemon cleaner. She untied her apron, folded it carefully, and slipped it into her locker before reaching for the silver necklace once more. It was an old habit. Every night before leaving, she gently touched the pendant, as though reassuring herself it was still there. She had done it since childhood without ever questioning why. "That billionaire really wanted your necklace," her co-worker Emily said with a playful smile as they walked toward the employee exit. "If someone offered me $10,000 for an old necklace, I would have sold it before he finished the sentence. Claire laughed softly, but her fingers remained around the pendant. Money replaces a lot of things, she answered. Some things cannot be replaced. Emily tilted her head. Family heirloom? Claire hesitated. Not exactly. The answer surprised even her. She had never truly known where the necklace came from. Her adoptive mother, Margaret Bennett, had given it to her on her 10th birthday with only a few simple words. Keep this safe. One day someone may come looking for it. If that day ever comes, listen before you decide what to do. Claire had asked countless questions afterward. Who did it belong to? Why was it important? Why had Margaret kept it hidden for so many years? The older woman always smiled gently and answered the same way. Some stories belong to the right moment, not the right age. When Margaret passed away 3 years earlier after a long illness, those answers disappeared with her. Claire stepped outside into the crisp evening air. Yellow taxi cabs rolled past beneath glowing streetlights, while office workers hurried toward the subway with paper cups still warming their hands. Life in New York never seemed to slow down, but Claire had learned to find peace inside its constant motion. She walked the 12 blocks home instead of taking the train. It saved money, and the quiet walk helped clear her mind after long shifts. Yet tonight her thoughts refused to settle. She kept replaying the expression on Daniel Harrington's face. It had not been greed. It had not been curiosity. It had looked painfully familiar, almost like someone recognizing an old photograph after many years. She reached her small apartment just before 10 o'clock. The building was old, the elevator unreliable, and the hallway lights flickered every few minutes. Still, it was home. Inside, the apartment was neat but modest. A bookshelf stood beside the window, filled with borrowed novels and secondhand history books. A small framed photograph of Margaret rested on the kitchen counter beside a potted fern that Claire somehow managed to keep alive despite her unpredictable schedule. She poured herself a glass of water and sat at the tiny table where unopened utility bills rested beside tomorrow's grocery list. Without thinking, she removed the necklace and placed it carefully in her palm. Under the warm kitchen light, the pendant looked exactly as it always had. Plain silver, softly worn edges, tiny engraved vines surrounding an oval center. She noticed the faint scratch near the clasp and smiled. Margaret used to joke that every scratch proved something had survived another year. Claire turned the pendant over slowly. She had examined it hundreds of times before, yet tonight it somehow felt different. Her thumb traced the delicate engraving along the back until it paused over a section that looked slightly darker than the surrounding silver. Almost hidden beneath years of wear, there appeared to be something else beneath the surface. Not a decoration, not damage. Tiny letters, almost invisible. Claire narrowed her eyes and carried the necklace closer to the kitchen lamp. Before she could make out the faded markings, her cell phone vibrated across the table. The screen displayed an unfamiliar number. She hesitated for a long moment before answering. A calm professional voice greeted her. "Good evening, Miss Bennett. My name is Richard Collins. I work for Mr. Daniel Harrington. He would like to speak with you tomorrow. If you are willing, his offer regarding your necklace has changed." Claire barely slept that night. The unfamiliar phone call lingered in her thoughts long after the apartment had fallen quiet. She had replayed every word Richard Collins had spoken, searching for something hidden between the polite sentences. Why would one of the most influential businessmen in the country ask to meet a waitress because of an old necklace? Why would he increase an offer that had already sounded unbelievable? By sunrise, she had reached only one conclusion. She would meet him, not because of the money, but because she wanted answers that had followed her since childhood. The next afternoon, after finishing the lunch shift, Claire walked into the lobby of Harrington Holdings. The towering glass building reflected the bright Manhattan sky like polished steel. Men and women in tailored suits crossed the marble floor carrying tablets and coffee cups, each moving with the quiet urgency of people whose calendars were planned months ahead. Claire glanced down at her simple navy dress and comfortable shoes. For a brief moment she felt out of place, but the feeling disappeared as quickly as it arrived. Margaret had always reminded her that dignity never depended on expensive clothes. Richard Collins greeted her with a respectful smile. He appeared to be in his early 60s, with silver hair, kind eyes, and the calm manner of someone who had spent decades solving difficult problems without raising his voice. "Miss Bennett, thank you for coming. He escorted her into a private conference room overlooking the Hudson River. Floor-to-ceiling windows filled the room with soft afternoon light. A single wooden table stood in the center beside 2 cups of untouched coffee. Daniel Harrington entered only moments later. He looked different from the confident businessman she had served the previous evening. His shoulders carried a quiet exhaustion that no tailored suit could hide. He remained standing for several seconds, his eyes once again finding the necklace resting above Claire's heart. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me," he said gently. Claire nodded. "Your assistant mentioned your offer changed." Daniel took a slow breath. It did. He placed a folder on the table, but made no effort to open it. $1 million. The room became completely silent. Even Richard lowered his eyes, allowing the number to settle naturally. Claire blinked once, certain she had misunderstood. $1 million was not simply life-changing. It was the kind of money that erased mortgages, paid medical bills, created businesses, and rewrote futures. Yet the first question that escaped her lips had nothing to do with money. "Why?" Daniel looked toward the windows before answering. "Because I do not believe I am trying to buy a necklace." Claire remained perfectly still. "Then what are you trying to find?" Daniel slowly reached into his wallet and removed an old photograph. Time had faded its colors, but the image remained clear enough. A smiling little girl with golden hair stood between 2 adults beside a lake, proudly wearing a small silver necklace around her neck. Claire felt her heartbeat quicken. The pendant in the picture looked almost identical to the one resting against her own chest. Daniel spoke so quietly that every word seemed to carry years of carefully buried grief. Her name was Lily. His fingers rested gently on the edge of the photograph. She was 6 years old. Claire looked from the picture to her own necklace and back again. The similarities were impossible to ignore. The same oval shape, the same engraved vines. Even the tiny clasp appeared identical. Daniel continued without taking his eyes off the photograph. 15 years ago, my family was involved in a terrible highway accident during a severe storm. Rescue teams searched for days. My daughter disappeared, and despite every effort, we never found her. He paused, collecting himself before continuing. The necklace disappeared with her. Claire felt a wave of emotion she could not explain. She remembered Margaret's voice as clearly as if she were standing beside her again. "Keep this safe. One day someone may come looking for it." She slowly reached beneath her collar and unclasped the pendant for the first time in years. Resting in her open palm, it seemed heavier than ever before. Daniel stared at it with quiet disbelief. Then he whispered something that neither wealth nor power had prepared him to say. "I think your necklace is the first real clue I have had in 15 years. Claire remained silent. For several moments, the silver pendant resting in the center of her palm, while afternoon sunlight reflected softly across its worn surface. Daniel did not reach for it. He did not ask to examine it. Instead, he simply looked at it with the quiet restraint of a father who had spent 15 years hoping that impossible things might still happen. Finally, Claire closed her fingers around the necklace once again. "I believe you," she said softly, "but I still cannot sell it." Richard Collins glanced toward Daniel, expecting disappointment, yet the billionaire merely nodded. "I was hoping you would say that." Claire looked surprised. Daniel smiled faintly for the first time since she had entered the room. "If you had accepted the money immediately, I would have questioned everything. This necklace clearly means something to you, even if you never knew its full story." Claire lowered her eyes. "It was the last gift my mother left me. She told me to protect it until someone came looking for it. She never explained why." Daniel leaned forward. "Your mother? Was she your biological mother?" Claire slowly shook her head. "No. Margaret Bennett adopted me when I was 10. She never hid that from me. She simply said that sometimes people become family because they choose to stay." Daniel absorbed every word with careful attention. The pieces still refused to fit together, but they were beginning to form the outline of a picture. "Do you know anything about your life before Margaret?" Claire answered honestly. "Very little. I remember moving often. I remember different foster homes. Faces faded with time. Margaret was the first person who ever made one place feel permanent." Daniel slowly opened the folder resting on the conference table. Inside were several photographs, newspaper clippings, and copies of old police reports. He turned one photograph toward Claire. It showed the necklace resting inside a small velvet jewelry box beside a handwritten birthday card. Claire noticed the card immediately. "Happy 6th birthday, Lily. Wherever life takes you." Remember that you will always carry our love close to your heart. Love, Mom and Dad. She felt an unexpected tightness in her chest. Daniel carefully lifted another photograph. This one showed the pendant much closer. There was one detail almost nobody knew, he explained. My wife insisted that the jeweler hide something inside the pendant. She wanted it to be like a tiny secret between parents and daughter. Claire looked down at her necklace instinctively. Inside, Daniel nodded. The jeweler created a concealed compartment so small that most people would never notice it. It required a specific movement to open. We never told anyone except Lily because she thought it was magical. Claire stared at the pendant resting in her hand. She had owned it for more than 16 years. She had polished it, cleaned it, and held it during the hardest moments of her life. Yet she had never imagined it could contain anything hidden. Daniel did not ask to touch it. Instead, he quietly demonstrated the motion using the enlarged photograph. The oval should rotate slightly to the left before the clasp is pressed. Claire carefully followed his instructions. At first, nothing happened. Then she felt the faintest click beneath her fingertips. The front of the pendant shifted no more than a fraction of an inch. Richard leaned forward in astonishment. Claire gently opened the tiny compartment hidden inside. Resting within was a folded piece of paper no larger than a postage stamp. Time had turned it pale yellow, but it remained perfectly protected. Claire looked up at Daniel, whose eyes had already filled with emotion. I have never seen that before, she whispered. Daniel slowly exhaled. Neither have I. His voice trembled with quiet honesty. My wife prepared that surprise herself. She wanted Lily to discover it when she turned 18. Claire unfolded the tiny paper with extraordinary care. The delicate handwriting was faded but still readable. Only one sentence appeared inside. If this necklace ever finds its way back home, then miracles still exist. No one in the room spoke. The city skyline beyond the windows remained as busy as ever, but inside the conference room, time seemed to pause. Daniel closed his eyes for a brief moment, not because the mystery had been solved, but because for the first time in 15 years, hope no longer felt like a memory. It felt possible. The words inside the tiny note remained on the conference table long after Claire carefully folded it again. Neither she nor Daniel seemed willing to disturb the fragile silence that had settled between them. Finally, Richard Collins cleared his throat gently. If Margaret Bennett knew this necklace would someday lead someone back to your family, then she must have known far more than anyone ever realized. Claire slowly nodded. She did not talk much about the past. Whenever I asked where the necklace came from, she always smiled and told me that the truth belonged to the people who had lived it, not the people who guessed about it. Daniel looked thoughtfully toward the skyline beyond the glass. Then we need to understand Margaret's story. Claire hesitated before answering. There is something I have never mentioned to anyone. Both men turned toward her. About 6 months before she passed away, Margaret asked me to promise her one thing. Claire paused, remembering the quiet hospital room where sunlight had rested across the blanket while machines hummed softly in the background. Margaret's voice had been weak but steady. She told me that if someone ever recognized the necklace, I should listen carefully before trusting my own memories. Daniel frowned slightly. Your own memories? Claire nodded. She said memory can protect people, but it can also hide things they are not ready to face. Daniel remained silent. He had spent 15 years relying on memories that grew less certain with every passing year. Faces blurred. Voices faded. Only the feeling of losing his daughter had remained painfully clear. Richard carefully organized the documents scattered across the table. Miss Bennett, may I ask something personal? Claire smiled politely. Of course. Do you have anything that belonged to Margaret besides the necklace? Claire thought for a moment. Only a small cedar box she kept inside her bedroom closet. She told me never to throw it away, even after she was gone. I have never opened it. Richard looked surprised. Never. Claire shook her head. It was tied with a faded blue ribbon. It somehow felt wrong to untie it after she passed away. Some things deserve patience. Daniel looked at her with quiet admiration. During his years in business, he had met countless people who rushed toward every answer, every opportunity, every advantage. Claire possessed something much rarer. She respected promises even when nobody was watching. Would you be willing to open it now? Daniel asked gently. Claire looked down at the necklace resting once again around her neck. Yes, I think Margaret knew this day would eventually come. They left the office together just before sunset. Daniel insisted that one of his drivers take them to Claire's apartment, but the ride felt surprisingly ordinary. They spoke little. The city rolled past outside the windows with its familiar rhythm of pedestrians, food carts, bicycle messengers, and children laughing in neighborhood parks. Wealth and simplicity seemed to exist side by side without either one noticing the other. When they reached Claire's apartment building, Daniel quietly observed the worn brick entrance and narrow staircase. Nothing about the place reflected luxury, yet everything reflected care. Inside, the apartment remained exactly as Claire had left it that morning. The small fern still rested beside Margaret's photograph. The books remained neatly arranged by the window. Daniel studied the picture of the smiling older woman. "She looks kind," he said softly. Claire smiled. She believed that kindness was the only investment guaranteed to grow with time. Claire walked into the bedroom and knelt beside the lowest shelf of an old wooden closet. After moving several folded blankets, she carefully lifted out a small cedar box wrapped exactly as she remembered. The faded blue ribbon remained tied in a simple bow, untouched for 3 years. She carried it into the living room with both hands, almost as though it were something alive. No one spoke. The room was so quiet that the ticking wall clock sounded unusually loud. Claire slowly loosened the ribbon, lifted the lid, and looked inside. Resting neatly on top was a sealed envelope with her name written across the front in Margaret's unmistakable handwriting. Beneath it lay another envelope addressed to Daniel Harrington. Claire stared at the 2 envelopes without moving. Her own name, written in Margaret Bennett's careful handwriting, immediately filled her eyes with emotion. The second envelope rested beside it with equal care, carrying only 2 words across the front. Daniel Harrington. Daniel slowly reached toward it, then stopped. "I do not think I should open this unless you want me to." Claire looked at him and smiled gently. "She addressed it to you. I think she expected this moment long before either of us did." Daniel nodded quietly. His fingers trembled almost imperceptibly as he broke the old seal. Claire opened her own letter at the same time. The apartment fell completely silent except for the soft rustle of aging paper. Margaret's handwriting remained steady despite the years. Claire read first. "My dearest Claire, if you are reading this, then the day I prayed for has finally arrived. Please remember one thing before anything else. You owe nobody your guilt because none of what happened was ever your fault." Claire felt her breathing slow. She continued reading. "I always wanted to tell you everything, but promises sometimes protect people better than explanations. I promised a frightened woman that I would keep her secret until the truth could no longer hurt the people she loved. I kept that promise because she was running out of time, and because she believed kindness would eventually finish what fear had interrupted." Claire lowered the letter for a moment, trying to understand every sentence. Across the room, Daniel remained completely still, his eyes fixed on Margaret's words. Richard quietly stepped back toward the window, giving both of them the privacy the moment deserved. Daniel finally spoke, but his voice was barely above a whisper as he continued reading aloud. "Mr. Harrington, if this letter reaches you, then your daughter has already found her way back into your life, even if neither of you realizes it yet. I know you have searched for answers for many years. I wish I could have carried this burden to you sooner. Please forgive an old woman who believed. Protecting children sometimes required painful silence." Daniel paused, swallowing carefully before continuing. "The little girl you lost was not the only child whose life changed that day. There was another frightened little girl standing nearby when strangers rushed to help. She had no family left to claim her, no safe place to return, and no voice willing to tell her story. Fate placed 2 innocent lives on the same road. One child carried a family's heartbreak. The other carried a family's hope." Claire looked up in confusion. "Another little girl?" Daniel slowly nodded, equally puzzled. Neither of them spoke until Claire resumed reading her own letter. Margaret's words became more personal. "Claire, I never adopted you because I felt sorry for you. I adopted you because your courage reminded me that broken beginnings do not decide beautiful endings. The necklace never belonged to you, but your promise did. You kept it safe without ever asking what reward waited at the end. That is exactly why I trusted you with it." Tears quietly gathered in Claire's eyes. Every memory of Margaret returned with astonishing clarity. The homemade birthday cakes, library visits every Saturday morning, long walks through neighborhood parks, Simple evenings reading together while rain tapped softly against the windows. Not once had Margaret treated her like someone rescued. She had simply loved her. Daniel carefully folded his letter and looked toward Claire. Margaret never says you are my daughter. Claire slowly shook her head. No, she does not. Richard stepped closer. Then perhaps the necklace was never leading us toward a person. Perhaps it was leading us toward the people who still know the rest of the story. Claire looked back into the cedar box. Beneath the letters rested a worn leather notebook, a folded highway map with several locations carefully circled in blue ink, and an old newspaper photograph of a volunteer rescue team standing beside flooded roads 15 years earlier. On the back of the photograph, Margaret had written only one sentence. Start with the man standing on the far left. He remembers what everyone else forgot. The following morning began before sunrise. Daniel, Claire, and Richard drove north along quiet highways while the city slowly disappeared behind them. The folded map from Margaret's cedar box rested on Richard's lap, its faded blue circles guiding them toward a small town nearly 3 hours away. According to the notes inside the leather notebook, the man in the old rescue photograph had retired years earlier and now lived alone near the same river where the accident had happened. None of them spoke very much during the drive. Each carried different questions, yet all of those questions pointed toward the same place. By late morning, they reached a modest white farmhouse surrounded by maple trees whose leaves had already turned shades of gold and crimson. An elderly man stood on the porch repairing a wooden birdhouse. His movements were slow but steady, the kind earned through decades of honest work. When he noticed the unfamiliar black sedan, he removed his glasses and watched quietly as the visitors approached. Richard stepped forward first. Good morning. Are you Samuel Carter? The old man nodded politely. Depends who is asking. Daniel introduced himself without mentioning his company or his wealth. My name is Daniel Harrington. We found your name inside a notebook that belonged to Margaret Bennett. At the sound of Margaret's name, Samuel's expression changed immediately. He looked past Daniel and stopped when his eyes reached Claire. For several long seconds, he said nothing at all. Then he smiled with unmistakable recognition. Well, he whispered softly. She finally brought you here. Claire exchanged a confused glance with Daniel. Samuel invited them inside. His home was simple, filled with photographs of grandchildren, fishing trips, and community gatherings. On one shelf rested an old framed picture of the volunteer rescue team from 15 years earlier. It was the same photograph Margaret had kept inside her cedar box. Samuel carefully poured coffee for everyone before sitting across from Claire. Margaret always believed this day would come, he said quietly. She asked me to wait until you found me instead of searching for you myself. Claire leaned forward. You knew Margaret? Samuel smiled warmly. We volunteered together after the storm. Those were difficult days. Roads were flooded. Families were separated. Everyone was trying to help strangers without knowing whose lives they were changing. Daniel listened without interrupting. Samuel turned toward him. I remember your family. The entire county remembered your family. Hundreds of people searched because nobody wanted to believe a little girl could simply disappear. Daniel lowered his eyes. We never stopped hoping. Samuel nodded with deep understanding. Hope kept many people working long after exhaustion should have sent them home. He stood slowly and walked toward an old wooden cabinet. From the top drawer he removed a weathered notebook wrapped inside clear plastic. Margaret asked me to protect this after she became ill. He handed it carefully to Claire. She said you would know when the time was right. Claire opened the notebook gently. Most of its pages contained handwritten names, dates, and places connected to families affected by the storm. Near the center, she found a folded sheet of paper tucked between 2 pages. It was not written by Margaret. The signature at the bottom belonged to someone named Evelyn Brooks. Samuel watched Claire's expression carefully. Evelyn was the nurse assigned to the emergency shelter that week. Claire unfolded the page and began reading aloud. The letter described 2 frightened little girls arriving within hours of each other. One wore an expensive silver necklace but could barely speak after the shock. The other arrived with no identification at all after losing every known relative. During the confusion of those overwhelming days, volunteers struggled to identify dozens of displaced families. Evelyn admitted that records were incomplete, and many children were transferred between shelters before relatives could be located. Claire reached the final sentence and stopped. Her voice trembled as she read it once more. The woman who carried the silver necklace begged us to keep searching for the little blonde girl because she believed the child was still alive. Before leaving the shelter, she entrusted the necklace to Margaret Bennett and said, "When my daughter comes home, she will know this belongs to someone she has not forgotten." Daniel remained motionless after Claire finished reading Evelyn Brooks's letter. The afternoon sunlight filtered through Samuel Carter's living room, casting long golden shadows across the worn wooden floor, yet none of them seemed aware of the passing time. Every sentence they had uncovered answered one question while creating three more. Claire carefully folded the fragile letter and slipped it back into the notebook exactly where she had found it. "If the necklace stayed with Margaret," she said quietly, "then someone must have taken Lily somewhere else." Samuel nodded slowly. That was always Margaret's belief. She never accepted that the story ended the way the official records suggested. Daniel finally looked up. "Did she ever tell you who the woman was? The one who handed her the necklace?" Samuel closed his eyes for a brief moment, searching through memories that had grown softer with age. "Only once. Margaret said the woman had been volunteering at the emergency shelter after losing her own sister during the storm. She was helping frightened children while carrying her own grief. She found the necklace near a blanket where a little blonde girl had been resting only minutes before. When volunteers turned around, the child was gone. Nobody knew whether a relative had picked her up, another rescue team had transferred her, or whether she had simply wandered away during all the confusion." Richard frowned thoughtfully. There had to be paperwork. Samuel gave a gentle smile that carried more sadness than amusement. "You are thinking like people think today? 15 years ago, that shelter was overflowing with frightened families, exhausted volunteers, and handwritten lists that became soaked in rain before sunrise. They did the best they could, but perfect records were impossible." Daniel lowered his head again. For the first time since this journey had begun, he understood that no single person had failed his family. Time, confusion, and tragedy had scattered countless small details until they became almost impossible to gather again. Claire looked through the remaining pages of the notebook. Most contained names already crossed out, families reunited years earlier, and addresses that no longer existed. Then she stopped at the final page. Tucked inside the back cover was a small business card, yellowed with age. Across the front was printed the name Grace Holloway, licensed family counselor. On the back, written in Margaret's familiar handwriting, appeared one sentence. She was the last person to see the little blonde girl smiling. Claire showed the card to Daniel. A quiet spark returned to his eyes. Richard immediately took out his phone, but Samuel gently placed a hand on his arm. "You will not find her through the internet. Grace retired years ago. She lives about 20 minutes from here, near Lake Ashton." Daniel looked toward the window where the afternoon breeze stirred the maple branches. "Can we still make it before sunset?" Samuel smiled. "If anyone can answer what happened next, it is Grace." Less than half an hour later, they were driving along narrow country roads lined with old stone fences and rolling fields. The landscape felt peaceful, almost untouched by the hurried rhythm of the city they had left behind that morning. Claire watched sunlight dance across the lake beside the road and found herself wondering how many ordinary places quietly protected extraordinary stories. Eventually, the car turned into a gravel driveway leading to a modest blue cottage surrounded by wildflowers. An elderly woman knelt in the garden trimming lavender bushes. She looked up as the vehicle approached, her silver hair catching the warm evening light. Before anyone spoke, her eyes settled on Claire. The gardening shears slipped gently from her hands. She stood very slowly, taking one careful step forward, then another. Daniel noticed the sudden change in her expression, but remained silent. Grace's gaze never left the necklace resting against Claire's collarbone. Tears gathered before she whispered words that sounded less like recognition and more like a memory returning home. "I know that necklace." Claire instinctively touched the pendant. "You have seen it before?" Grace nodded, unable to hide the emotion in her voice. "Not just the necklace." She looked directly into Claire's eyes with quiet certainty. "I remember the little girl who refused to let go of it, even while asking only one question over and over again." Daniel felt his heartbeat quicken. Grace took another gentle step toward Claire before softly repeating the words that had waited 15 years to be heard again. She kept asking, "Has anyone seen my daddy?" Grace invited them inside without another word. The little cottage smelled of fresh lavender and old books, and every shelf seemed to hold photographs collected over a lifetime of helping families through their hardest days. She disappeared briefly into a nearby room before returning with a weathered storage box. Its corners were worn smooth by time, and a faded label read, "Community Shelter Records." Grace placed it gently on the kitchen table and carefully lifted the lid. "I promised myself I would never throw these away," she said softly. "Not because I believed someone important would come looking for them, but because every child deserves to have their story remembered." She sorted through dozens of carefully preserved folders until she found one marked only with a date from 15 years earlier. Inside rested several handwritten notes, a faded Polaroid photograph, and a volunteer intake form that had never been completed. Grace handed the photograph to Daniel first. His hands began to tremble before he even looked at it. A little blonde girl sat beneath a wool blanket, holding a silver necklace tightly against her chest. Beside her knelt Grace, smiling gently while offering the child a cup of hot chocolate. On the back of the photograph, Grace had written one sentence: "Waiting for her father." Daniel quietly closed his eyes as tears rolled down his face. He recognized his daughter's smile instantly. Time had changed nothing. Claire looked at the photograph next. Something stirred deep inside her memory. Not a complete picture, only fragments. The scent of rain, bright emergency lights reflecting across wet pavement, a warm cup held carefully between small hands, someone wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. She placed a hand against her forehead as another memory slowly surfaced. "I remember the hot chocolate," she whispered. Grace looked at her with gentle surprise. "Yes," she answered softly. "You asked if your father would know where to find you." Daniel looked up immediately. "You said she was waiting for her father." Grace nodded. She never stopped believing he would come. She opened the unfinished intake form and pointed toward a line that had faded with age. The child could only remember one word clearly: "Daddy." She was frightened, exhausted, and unable to tell us her last name. Before we could finish the paperwork, another emergency transport arrived with several children who needed immediate medical attention. During the confusion, a couple approached the shelter claiming they had information about a missing little girl matching her description. They were directed to another registration table while volunteers tried to verify everything. When we returned, the child was gone. Daniel listened without interrupting. Grace continued. "We believed another rescue team had transferred her. By the time everyone compared records, several shelters had already exchanged families, and the trail disappeared. Margaret spent years trying to reconnect every missing piece she could find. She never gave up." Richard carefully examined the remaining papers until one folded document slipped from the folder. It was an official notice filed several weeks after the storm. A young girl matching Lily Harrington's description had eventually been located hundreds of miles away, but because of incomplete identification and the absence of surviving relatives able to confirm her identity at the time, she had entered the foster care system under temporary records that were never connected to the original case. Claire slowly covered her mouth. Daniel looked at her, then back at the document. Every unanswered question suddenly fit together with heartbreaking simplicity. Claire had never been Lily. She had been another frightened child whose life crossed Lily's for only a few brief hours. Margaret had protected the necklace until the day it could guide the truth home. Daniel stood quietly and walked toward Claire. Without saying a word, he embraced her with the gratitude of a father whose hope had finally found direction. "You kept a promise that was never even yours," he whispered. "Because of you, I finally know where to continue searching." Several months later, Daniel's foundation established the Margaret Bennett Family Reconnection Initiative to help reunite missing families and preserve forgotten records before time could erase them forever. Claire continued working at the restaurant she loved, but every weekend she volunteered with the foundation, helping strangers search for the people they had never stopped loving. The silver necklace was placed inside a museum exhibit honoring the volunteers who refused to let hope disappear after the storm. Beneath it rested a simple plaque with Margaret's favorite words. "Some promises are not measured by how long we keep them. They are measured by how many lives they quietly bring back together."